Good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I'm the president of the American Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our American Academy lecture with writer-in-residence Fred Kaplan. The topic tonight is Past and Future Cold Wars, Lessons for Winners and Losers. For those of you who are attending closely to my remarks, it may sound like we've invented a new category of people who we are bringing to the Academy, specifically writers in residence, not just fellows and distinguished fellows, and you are paying excellent attention. As we've come back to in-person meetings, travel has become more frequent since the worst of the pandemic. We at the Academy are receiving ever more numbers of inquiries, ever greater number of inquiries from journalists, novelists, nonfiction writers who are eager to visit Berlin, a capital that continues to grow in global importance, but who can't spend a whole semester here, or in some cases somehow miss the application deadline. In any case, there is far too much talent in this pool to be ignored, and I feel it's my job to bring in the very best from America here, whether they've applied or not. So using my very august presidential powers, I created this new class of visitor, and Fred is our first, I believe. Maybe there were some before my time, but he was our first writer in residence, and later this spring, the superb nonfiction writer Ian Buruma will also join us here at the Hans Arnold Center. So congratulations, Fred, and thank you very much for also bringing the very distinguished journalist Brooke Gladstone with you, so that we start off with a twofer and we feel like we got a great bargain. I'm explaining this to you tonight because last night one of our guests at the event with historian John Connolly took me to task for not being more forthright about asking people to support the Academy. And so tonight I'm glad to announce that anyone here who wants to underwrite a writer in residence at the Academy, well, the door is open, and I think we can do a deal. Thus endeth the commercial message. Now, back to tonight's lecture. Fred Kaplan is, of course, talking about one of the most important topics before us, and one indication of that is that we recently hosted the distinguished Columbia political scientist Michael Doyle here. I think it was just a month ago, and we discussed the closely related issue of whether we could achieve a cold peace as an alternative to a Cold War. Tonight's talk will discuss how the current situation with Russia and the not really quite Cold War will shape up, how it will shape the international landscape for decades to come. So about Fred himself. Fred is national security columnist for Slate and the author of 6 books, including The Bomb, Dark Territory, The Wizards of Armageddon, which was the first, right? And the first to pierce my consciousness, and The Insurgents. Fred previously reported for the Boston Globe. He was based in Washington from 1982 to 91, and he was part of a group that won a Pulitzer Prize for the Globe's special magazine coverage of the nuclear arms race. And as someone who was subscribing to the Globe as a college student way back when, I think I have been reading Fred Kaplan for about as long as he has been writing, and happily so. He also reported for the Globe from Moscow from 1992 to 95, and from an even tougher story, New York, 1995 to 2002, and he continues to live in New York to this very day. A member of the Society of American Historians, Fred has held fellowships at the Council on Foreign Relations and at New America. New York Times Book Review said about Fred, he has a gift for elucidating abstract concepts, cutting through national security jargon, and showing how leaders confront or, surprisingly, avoid dilemmas. As someone who was on both sides of the track as a journalist and then later in the national security world, I am happy to say that Fred is one of the few who really gets it, and I'll stake my reputation on that, such as it is. Anyway, I'm looking forward to his insights on this really timely topic tonight. Let me, before giving the floor to Fred, just say a few words about the format. Fred will speak for about 30 minutes. He and I will have a brief discussion, and there will be an audience Q&A. If you're here at the Academy, just raise your hand to ask a question in the time-honored tradition. And if you are joining us via Zoom, please type your question in the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, not in the chat. And with that, Fred, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all of you coming and appreciate being here at the courtesy of the American Academy. I actually thought that I would be a distinguished visitor here, but distinguished visitor, writer in residence, it doesn't really matter. We're fine with either way. It's been a wonderful time, and we've been making as much of it as we can. I should say offhand that, as some of my colleagues here can attest, I have a bit of a cough. It's not a cold. It's not a virus. Nobody's going to get anything. It's a bronchial sort of thing. But it might be a little bit alarming here and there. But, you know, it's kind of like what, just keep in mind, it's kind of like what Mark Twain said of Wagner's music, that it's not as bad as it sounds. So the thesis that I'm putting forward tonight is that what's happening now, either with the U.S. relations with Russia or China or whatever, it is not a new Cold War. In fact, it is nothing like a Cold War as we've understood that term. What does that term mean? And it goes back quite a ways. I mean, the Cold War that we all knew between the Soviet Union and the United States, I mean, we're talking about a civilizational conflict. Oversimplifying a little bit, the U.S. and the Soviet Union controlled the two spheres of the globe. We disagreed on everything. We competed in every sphere as peer powers. We offered up our whole way of life as something to either emulate or to force upon the countries that were part of that sphere. And this goes way back. It's always been like this. Our speaker from last night will appreciate that I've looked into the deep origins of the phrase Cold War and found it going back to the 14th century. Don Juan Manuel referring to a Cold War as the civilizational conflict between Christianity and Islam. So again, to talk about a Cold War, as many people are doing now, as simply tensions or a conflict that hasn't quite bubbled into war, that's not really what we mean. I mean, when the people who invented or reinvented the phrase Cold War right after World War II, people like Orwell or George Kennan, he didn't come up with that word, but others who did, they were talking about, as Orwell put it, a condition where you have a small number of monstrous nation states dividing the world because of the presence of the nuclear bomb, and that they would intimidate all the other powers to the point that there would be this persistent, unending Cold War. I mean, it was something that was huge and dominating everything. Well, you know, that's not what's going on with Russia or with China. With Russia, I mean, there's a real war going on. It's kind of we're a proxy to, but it really doesn't go much beyond Central Europe. With China, again, they're not interested in spreading the gospel of the CCP to the rest of the world. In fact, their view of global expansion is the exact opposite of what you would think of the Cold War. They don't care what a country believes in or what else they practice or what kind of economics they have or ideology. They want to make inroads, have trade, do investment, set up ports, whatever, with any kind of power. So it's not a civilizational war. It is, and in fact, during the Cold War, I think the United States and Russia had something like 1% of their trade was with each other. Well, with China, it's in double digits. And while that doesn't mean that, contrary to what a lot of Germans used to think, it doesn't mean trade doesn't mean peace, but it means that it's a complicated relationship. It's not a simple black and white, A and B. So then the question becomes, well, if this isn't a Cold War, if it's not an inherent, irreconcilable, existential conflict on multiple levels that's somehow global or at least all regional, then what do we have? What is going on in the world? And I think to understand this, we need to go back to the end of the real Cold War. Or actually, I could go back to the end of World War II with decolonization, or even the end of World War I and the split up of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm sure there are some people in the audience who might want me to go back to King Charlemagne in the 8th century. But I'm not going to do that right now, maybe in Q&A. But I'm just going to, in the interest of keeping this story somewhat coherent, I'm going to go back to the end of the Cold War. So what happened at the end of the Cold War? It was pretty unequivocal, pretty unambiguous. We won, they lost. To the extent where the Soviet Union blew up, just imploded, disappeared overnight. Something that George Kennan said would happen one day actually did. And their entire empire not only shattered, but over the next decade kind of joined what had been the opposition empire, or a series of alliances, which enlarged to meet them, often at their desperate request. Now, this event was terribly misunderstood by George W. Bush and Dick Cheney in particular. You might recall the phrase, the unipolar moment. It was believed that we are the only superpower left. We can do anything we want, and we don't need allies. You might remember when, even to the point when New York and Washington were attacked on September 11th, and for the first time, Article 5 of the NATO treaty was invoked, but it was invoked by the European allies, saying, we will come to your effect. And basically, George Bush said, never mind. We can do without you, essentially. Which, what was kind of, he didn't care. They didn't care. We don't need allies. Alliances weigh you down. We don't need this. We can do this all by ourselves. Now, what they didn't realize is that, in fact, we had always needed allies. But what had happened during the Cold War was that a lot of our allies kind of did things that we wanted them to do, even if it wasn't entirely in their interest, because they looked across the horizon and saw the growling bear on the other side and said, okay, I'll stick with you because I'll put up with that more than I'll put up with the alternative. And so, for example, in 1970, and this affected other countries in the world too. For example, in 1970s, Anwar Sadat of Egypt decided he didn't want to be a member of the Soviet alliance anymore. Now, he had only one choice to make, and that was to join the American alliance. From being a recipient of Soviet weapons and having Soviet officers training their military, he went to buying American weapons and sending their, best soldiers to West Point. And it was a complete switch. Whereas now, for example, Egypt is buying weapons from the US and Russia and Germany and France and Italy. They're kind of doing whatever they want to do. You even have a situation where, before the invasion of Ukraine, and it was thought that the big story, the big new alliance was going to be the Quad. When's the last time you read a newspaper story which even mentioned the Quad? It was the US, India, Japan, and Australia. And it was going to be the big, containment vehicle against China. Well, now you have a situation where the second biggest member of this alliance, India, is on the other side of us from on the war with Ukraine, because they have their own situation with China, and so they want to keep friendly with Russia as part of the containment gesture against China. So the point is, even among our closest allies, there is no unity. There is no coherence necessarily. What we really have going on is a state of fragmentation, a fragmented power, where, Ian Bremmer has referred to this as G0. I don't think that's quite right, but it's not even really multipolar, because the big countries in certain spheres might not be big countries in some other sphere. And poles, they don't just rise above everybody else, but that they attract. Things wrap around the poles or become adhered to the poles. And you have, again, some situations where, India is with us on some things, but against us on other things. Hungary, Turkey, members of NATO, for Christ's sake, they're not with us on things that you would think would be fundamental to NATO, much less to any number of things. So we have a fragmented polity, in which case, really, what we're looking at is something that's much closer to what has been kind of standard international relations through much of world history, where there's kind of an anarchic situation, and there are alliances of convenience, and sometimes of other things as well, but they're not necessarily long-lasting, and they're not necessarily global. With the following exceptions, there are some modern twists that, of course, didn't exist back in the 19th century or whatever. The first and most obvious is nuclear weapons. The second is instantaneous awareness and communications. And third is a certain amount of interdependence. Now, the question, and I don't have an answer on this, and I don't even know if anybody has researched the question very deeply, but do these modern filigree to this new kind of anarchy, do they make the world more stable or less stable? Do they make war less likely or more likely? Nuclear weapons, a case can be made that the existence of nuclear weapons has prevented, a dozen wars over the last several decades. Now, if one day there is a big nuclear war that wipes out most of the human race, then this is small consolation. But in the meantime, there would have been a lot of wars if this baseline nuclear deterrence, and I think nuclear deterrence is actually a lot less complicated than people think it is, which we can talk about if you want. And then instantaneous communications. It's worth noting that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was, 60 years ago, which in the scheme of things isn't that long ago, when Kennedy and Khrushchev had their communications in the last few days, this was sent on Western Union telegrams. A courier, came by the White House to get the message and then took it over to Western Union, and it was, hours would go by. Now, does this make leaders more cautious because they understand that they don't really know a lot of what's going on now? Or less cautious because they're misunderstanding a lot of things? I don't know. Even the hotline, when it was installed in 1963, largely because of the difficulty in communication during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was initially a teletype. And it was a teletype that went from the White House to the Pentagon and then was encoded and then sent out as a transmission. In other words, contrary to the movies Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove, when, remember, the president in Failsafe says to his interpreter, "I want you to pay attention to the tone of the president. What do you interpret?" No, there was no tone. There was a teletype. Or, the great, the conversation from President Mervyn Muckley. "Yes, Dmitry, yes, I'm fine. Oh, I'm glad you're fine. Yes, I agree. It's fine to be fine." There was none of this. There was no way. I was just looking into this today because I couldn't remember. When was the first time that a president actually spoke to a Russian premier on the telephone? And I really looked this. I couldn't find anybody. I called people I knew, but they didn't know. It might not have been until George H.W. Bush was talking with Mikhail Gorbachev, right as Gorbachev was, disbanding the Soviet Union and stepping down. And I remember Bush saying, what you're doing is very commendable. And I remember this because it was actually broadcast live on American television. And I remember thinking, I wonder if Gorbachev knows that this rather humiliating moment is being broadcast live all over the world. I suspect he did not. But the point is, that's one of the things that's quite commonplace now that wasn't in this old style of war. But again, I don't know if this makes things better or worse. When the defense minister of Russia decides not to pick up the phone when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff calls, does that make things worse than in an old situation when they had no phone to talk to? Does it create certain anticipations? Again, I'm not sure. But that is the one thing that's quite different from what goes on. The thing to remember about the Cold War, and this is most deeply understood in Germany and especially in Berlin, is that in addition to all of its horrors, the Cold War was a system of international security. I mean, it laid out the groundworks. In the Cold War, it laid out the terrain. It defined who was what and what was where and what the red lines were, quite literally. And now, and this is the main reason why what's going on now is not a Cold War, we basically have no system of international security. There is, what is keeping us together, except maybe nuclear deterrence on a very basic level. But what is keeping everybody together? What are our assumptions in talking with each other? Now, it may be, as happened in the 19th century, that at some point the 3 or 5 great powers will meet in Geneva or Vienna and split up the world, and each will control its own sphere of influence. But there's certainly no condition for that now. And in fact, it may be that unless we're all ruled by kings and emperors someday, that this may not ever be possible again, to have this sort of, okay, this is ours, this is theirs, this, and we all run it and go from there. I think this may be impossible to restore, in which case the question is, well, then what is the basis for peace and stability? And of course, there are things like the UN. And I'm not one of those who thinks that the UN is useless. It certainly has a moral voice. It certainly has, especially on very specific things, real functionality. But especially now when by charter, by unchangeable charter, you have Russia and China as part of the Security Council, there's a limit to what the UN can do. And I don't see the basis for any other sort of supranational organization. At an otherwise very interesting seminar that I was at a week or so ago, somebody raised the idea that we now have a tripolar world. It's the U.S., China, and the European Union. And I remember thinking, well, the Indians will find this very interesting. The Brazilians will find this very interesting. And in fact, the European Union will find this very interesting because it means they don't need to get their act together on everything that they're trying to get their act in because they're already a pole. Well, no, except maybe for the poles, they're not a pole right now. They're not exerting the influence of a major power. So it's not a superpower. Now, it's not a Cold War in the sense that we're familiar with a Cold War. But this is not just a semantic distinction that I'm making. It has profound implications for what we do about this, what our policy should be, what a smart policy toward allies and adversaries and countries that aren't quite allies and adversaries should be. For example, you have the situation of John Mearsheimer saying, well, we're back into the tragedy of great powers, tragedy of Great power politics, yes. And what do great powers do? Well, they go to war. That's just what they do. And the great power now is the United States and China. So therefore, we need to finish up this war in Ukraine and get back in bed with the Russians so that we can form an alliance against China. Well, aside from many, many other factors, things that can be said about this, there's actually plenty of examples in the world where great powers did not go to war with each other, not the least of which being the United States and the Soviet Union. Now Mearsheimer has said in response to that, we had nuclear deterrence and we had, big garrisons of forces right on the east-west German border. So, of course, that prevented them from going to war. Well, why? Why did it? If you think that war among great powers is inevitable, that this is what great powers do by definition, why would that have made any difference? Plus, we have a nuclear deterrence situation with China to some degree. Why isn't that preventing inevitable war between China and Russia? It's trying to make a system out of something where there is no system. At the same time, it's destructive, it's self-destructive to say, okay, our main adversary now is China. So, hey, all you guys in Europe, you've got to join up with us. I know you've got a lot of trade going on with China, but it's time to back off of that. We really need to form a common alliance on this. And it is true for many reasons having to do more with convenience than anything else, that a lot of countries are looking at ways to reduce to thin out the supply chain with China, to make us less dependent. I mean, I was talking with an economist not long ago who said, you can get a PhD in economics without not merely taking not one course, but even 1 week of a course in supply chain economics. This is a very esoteric field, kind of like in military what logistics would be. You can read all the great strategists, all the great tacticians, and not have the slightest idea how to transport, a division's worth of artillery shells from here to there. It's a completely different thing. Same thing. So, but the point is, we go back to the point about fragmentation. We are really in no position to tell Germany or France or whoever, okay, time to lay off the China source now. They might say, that's an interesting idea. We'll study it at the next board meeting. Now let's talk about something that we have something in common about. We don't have the leverage to do this. So, when Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State, he came to Prague. And even as Russia was kind of building up along the border, he was giving a speech about the evils of the CCP and how we have to engage in regime change in China. And I wasn't there, but I imagine a lot of people in Prague were saying, what is he talking about? Blinken, to his credit, at least they got in and they said, okay, look, we all have our own things with China. It's kind of inevitable. We should get more common about this, but we're not going to punish you for maintaining a trade relationship with China. And the reason for that is that there's no choice. But I do see in press coverage, even though I am of the press, I guess, when China, everything is still looked at in this kind of black and white framework. For example, Foreign Minister of China brings in counterparts from Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they restore diplomatic relations. And they agree to continue a ceasefire in Yemen. And the common headline was, oh no, China is expanding its footprint in the world. They're becoming a big power in the Middle East as the United States retreats and loses influence in the Middle East. This is, oh no, new Cold War. And my view of that was, welcome to our nightmare. If you guys want to have an influential position in the Middle East, if you want to invest yourself in dealing with these biblical era conflicts, fine. You too shall soon enjoy the dark side of being a major power. Besides that, it really doesn't mean it. It's not like the Sunni Shiite cleave has been mended. It's not like China is moving in aircraft carriers that it doesn't have into the Mediterranean. It's not like the Fifth Fleet has been told to go home. It's not like, things haven't really changed that much. And I think that by pretending that we're in a zero-sum game with China where we don't have common or converging interests, and anything that is an up for them is a down for us, and vice versa. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, look, hey, if Saudi Arabia and Iran aren't going to go to war with each other, that I think is very much in our interests. At the moment, the United States is incapable, for a lot of reasons, of even getting these guys in the same room, much less to shake hands and sign a document. So if China can do this, again, maybe I've floated your reputation here by bringing me here, but my view is fine. I mean, the United States has been trying to minimize, or at least downplay, cut down its presence in the Middle East. Here we go. This is a great issue to do it on. I remember talking to a senior advisor to the Biden campaign, who is now a senior official, or mid-senior official, and he said, the way we are looking at the world, the regions, in the following order of priority: Asia Pacific, Europe, South America, the Middle East. Which I thought maybe overdid it a little bit, but still, this is a perfect issue to kind of stay out of the Middle East. Why does it always have to be us? It hasn't got us that much over the years, quite honestly. And since we're no longer so dependent on Saudi oil, our stakes in this are even less than they should be. And by playing it up, we're really helping Xi Jinping look more powerful and more global than he really is. Now, one other thing, another way that this whole, whether you call it a Cold War or not, President Biden and others have looked at the conflict as between democracy and authoritarianism. I think this is a very big mistake for a variety of reasons, both actual and pragmatic. For one thing, the reason why he did this initially was very clever. He wanted to pass his very ambitious domestic program, and he would do it by saying, we needed to do this so it looks like we can do things. Democracies can do things. China's doing all this stuff. We have to show the world, no, democracies can do this too. And he actually had a precedent, and he would be maybe the only president who actually remembers this personally. That when Dwight Eisenhower was president, Eisenhower, major education bill. I mean, did more to elevate science in high schools and colleges. This was called the National Defense Education Act, because said, oh my God, Soviets have put Sputnik up in the air. We've got to, I even took a course on the modern novel in high school that was funded by the National Defense Education Act. He also created the interstate highway system, and this was called the National Defense Highway Act. And one rationale was, well, if there's a nuclear war, we need to evacuate the cities. We need to have these highways. And this is how these, and I think it worked with Biden for the first infrastructure bill as well. People said, yeah, we've got to do this because China, we need to show that we know how to do the world. We know how to do this kind of thing. But then the question becomes, and this is where I have a problem with the whole thing, one problem, what if it turns out we can't do a lot of big things? What if our politics, and I'm speaking mainly of the United States, but I think that the same can be said of European countries as well. What if just things are too fallen apart for us to do this kind of thing, and presenting this, setting this up as a competition between democracy and authoritarianism? Aren't we kind of playing a loser's game here? The other thing is that, according to a Pew poll, which was taken last year, only about 17% of the world's population looks at the United States as an example to emulate. And in countries like Germany and France, I think it was even less. I think that the high point was Italy, which was 32%. But that was about as high as it went. And if you look at things like Freedom House, where now 20%, less than 20% of the world lives in what they count as a free country. I mean, is this really the centerpiece of the competition that we want to be having with China? Something where, we're not really maybe on the winning side of this game. A lot of people in the world look at what Xi Jinping is doing and saying, that doesn't look too bad. I mean, especially the leaders of these other countries. I think in his State of the Union message, Biden, whom I admire in many ways, said, name one leader in the world, one who would trade places with Xi Jinping. And I remember thinking, I can think of a dozen or so who really wouldn't mind that trade at all. So, and I notice that, I remember last year Biden had this democracy summit. I think there's another one happening next week. Right now? Oh, well. And there were 111 countries invited to this thing. And Freedom House had said that I think 29 of them were not free or only partly free. But really, what was really going on here? I mean, Pakistan was invited. Why? Because, India was invited and you couldn't really quite. Iraq was invited. Because, you couldn't have Israel being the only country in the Middle East that was invited. So basically, all this really came down to geopolitics. All of it came down to balancing off lots of things. And democracy, listen, I'm not denouncing it as a goal or saying that it should be no part of our foreign policy. I don't believe that at all. But it can't be the center, and to the extent it can be the center, there are two things worth noting. Around the time of last year's summit, the editors of Politico asked 18 experts and activists in endangered democracies, what should the United States do to help democracy? And their answer, as if they were reading from a script, was stop lecturing us, get your own act together, set yourself up as an example again. And you remember in 1994, on his 90th birthday, George Kennan, who of course was, the founder of the containment policy and so forth, said in a speech, it is primarily by example, never by precept, that a country such as ours exerts its most useful influence beyond its borders. Now, I was looking for a kind of a hopeful note to end this talk on, but I don't know. I mean, the possibly the irony, what could turn out to be the tragedy of the current moment is that just as America's foremost alliance, namely NATO and the European Union, kind of gets back on track and returns to its core mission after 30 years of trying to find some other mission that made it a lick of sense. And they're actually doing pretty well and making a good impression. At this very moment, United States internal politics are making this very difficult to sustain. I don't need to recite chapter and verse of what's going on there, but the difference of a single president or another 3 or 4 members of the Senate can really change all of that around. And I'm afraid to report from my homeland that I was asking Dan about this the other day. I can really only think of about 5 senators who really care much about foreign policy. And if a foreign policy starts costing a lot, either in terms of money or lives, then that'll start being reflected in popular opinion as well. So I am ending this on a rather doleful note, I'm afraid, where there is no system, there's no Cold War, which in some ways is good, right? But the reason for this is because there's no real system of international security, nor do there seem to be the underlying elements for such a system. Outside of NATO, perhaps, but the internal politics of the constituent members of NATO do not have really long-term prospects for that. So I don't expect applause at the end of that line, but I will now retire to the chair, and I see my cough has disappeared completely for some reason, which is interesting.
Fred, thank you for putting a lot on the table and for making me nostalgic for the Cold War.
Yeah.
And
remember the line in 3 Days of the Condor? The John Houseman character, he was nostalgic for the Cold War, and he said, why? And he goes, because of the certainty.
Yeah.
The certainty. Yeah.
One of my all-time favorite movies. Where are we with that, Max von Sydow? Okay, so let's recapitulate a little. So there's no Cold War because we don't have an ideological and even kind of systemic conflict. We don't have a Cold War because, in fact, we're pretty economically interdependent, at least with the Chinese. Of course, Xi Jinping is talking about preparing his country for a hot war, so that could change things.
And it still wouldn't be a Cold War.
That would be a hot war, yeah. You left me, wondering what I should wish for. So the Cold War, 60, 80 million people got killed in proxy conflicts around the world. I don't think we want that. At the same time, in fact, the connectivity between the superpowers is much less than it was through the Cold War. There was never a time in the Cold War when we weren't in close touch and when our experts weren't talking to their experts. I think actually Johnson and Kosygin spoke in 1967. I could be wrong.
You might be right.
But even more than that, we had all these confidence-building measures, and we had arms control, and we really did recognize what was at stake, and we really were talking to each other a lot. John McLaughlin, the former acting director of the CIA, has been saying for a number of years, no one's talking to anyone. And so the possibility for an accident to expand into a catastrophe is really quite great. And I guess that supports your fundamental thesis that it's not clear which is a better situation. Yeah. I do tend to think a real Cold War is worse and that we might avoid having tens of millions of dead people around the world. I guess I would begin where you ended and say that there is a ray of hope in the revitalization of the transatlantic alliance. And while it is true that for every European enthusiast for Biden and the revitalization of the Atlantic, there's two people wondering what happens if Trump comes back. But it is a big deal what has happened. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, NATO was floundering around for years. The whole idea of a new strategic concept was like the quadrennial joke. And, we're really taking it quite seriously now.
No, I definitely think that's true. Excuse me. I also think it's true that, the very fact that Germany is talking about its responsibilities in the world, or even in Europe, even though they haven't yet come up with what those responsibilities are, the fact that they even recognize it as a legitimate and even urgent question is something kind of astonishingly new. Again, I don't know where it's going, but still, it shows that something's happening. No, absolutely. Look. Let's say if Donald Trump had been reelected, and I've been told that his intention was to get out of NATO and to abandon...
John Bolton said that.
And but even more reliable people said that. Even, pull troops out of South Korea, leave Japan to its, And then let's say Putin had done something in Ukraine, although maybe he would have thought he didn't have to. But then, and let's say nothing would have happened then. Or even, let's say, Biden were president, and the same U.S. intelligence officials who were in the minority in saying that, Putin is really preparing an invasion. We're also saying Kiev will probably collapse in a couple of weeks. If that had happened, things would be very different from what they are now. No, I think we are still very much, and one reason why neither I nor very many other people, as far as I know, can come up with answers to a lot of the questions I'm posing, is that we're very much in a transitional period. Is it pre-war? Is it post-war? Usually you don't know while you're going through that era, or it might be both at once. We are what was also the Gramsci line, the old war has died, the new war has not yet been born, and in the interim there is much morbidity. So we're living in a period of much morbidity. And I think the kinds of questions and uncertainties are a phenomenon of, kind of a classic phenomenon of morbidity.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to also pick up on the issue. You said the U.S. doesn't have the leverage over Europe to get it to do what it wants, what the U.S. wants vis-a-vis China. And I was wondering, I want to examine that a little more closely. First of all, so the U.S. is maybe not a coercive power the way China or Russia may be, but it's been a bit coercive when it comes to throwing around its economic weight, as I think Abe Newman, who's out there somewhere, would agree. And it has leveraged now you're coughing,
no, I'm coughing.
See. Yeah.
I'm getting uncomfortable.
You just don't like conflict. It's leveraged the sanctions tool and the reserve status of the dollar to basically point a path in a particular direction. So, okay, we our kind of express policy is we as a democratic nation don't coerce others, but this is a powerful argument for why you should do as we do. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Also, I would reemphasize, maybe more than I did up there, again, I think China's power in a lot of these things is overrated. They have leverage over a particular situation maybe, but it's not so broad-based. Even militarily, and it's worth noting that there is not a single soldier or any other kind of member of the armed forces of China who has ever, in his entire life, fired a weapon for the purpose of killing somebody. The last time China was in any kind of war was in 1979. It was a brief border skirmish with Vietnam, and they didn't come off too well.
No, they didn't come off too well. It's a little more than a border
but they didn't come off too well.
Yeah.
They have all these, these swarms of anti-ship munitions and an anti-satellite capability. Balloons, yeah. But can they really coordinate like an invasion? And if you look at this isn't exactly beach territory, the advanced approach of Taiwan, it's not a sure thing. I had a professor once who talked about the fallacy of small-scale maps, where, here's China, and here's Taiwan, and it looks like, this will be over in an hour and a half. It doesn't work that way. I think, again, this is, and I don't want to get into this too deeply because I'd be getting above my head quite quickly, but China has a lot of economic problems too. They have an enormous debt problem, and a lot of the debt is funded by non-productive resources, as they say. I think a lot of this is making way. I think a good propaganda effort on our part should be in order. That wouldn't do it, but I think that this business of affirming and the cover of every issue of The Economist that China's on top of the world and we're on the bottom, we're sliding down steeply. I think A, it's not true, and B, it helps them out.
Well, as it seems to me, kind of, you're going back and forth a little here. And,
I am.
You know, sometimes we're weakening, sometimes we're strengthening. I want to press you a little on your vision of kind of the U.S. geopolitical position. I've just made the argument that the Atlantic Alliance is stronger than it has been in a long time, and you know, I think that's a good thing. It is true that our relationship with India and our now 20 or 30 year long effort to bring them on sides has shown mixed success, but at the same time, Japan, South Korea, Australia, a number of other countries in the Pacific Rim are really happy to sign up to join us in balancing against China. And you could make an argument that our alliances are stronger than they have been, I don't know, since at any time, certainly since we left Vietnam.
I think that's probably true because, we do agree. It is true to the extent that we agree on a common foe. And Xi Jinping, in this sense, has been our great friend by doing very reckless and sometimes just confounding things. I mean, there are things he could do that could be much more clever and successful than if one of his goals was to make everybody calm before the storm. But yeah, no, I would agree with that. I would also, but it goes both ways. I mean, I think not joining the TPP was a major mistake. And by the way, that was not just Trump. Hillary Clinton was backing away from that as well because labor unions were very much against it. She, who had once written that it was the gold standard of trade agreements, in one of her debates with Trump said, "Oh, yeah, there's a lot of problems with it." Now, was that bullshit? Was she going to make one or two little cosmetic changes and then sign it? Yeah, probably. But I do think that, I think you're right. For the core things, Europe against Russia, the major allies against at least being on board to some degree on containment of China. And I also found it very interesting that on the same day when Putin, when Xi went to the Kremlin, the foreign or defense minister of Japan went to Ukraine.
Right, unheard of.
That was interesting.
Right.
I think to the extent that our problems can be dealt with in traditional Cold War ways, and these two things can, then actually we're in much better shape than we could.
Are those traditional Cold War ways, or are those just traditional realpolitik ways?
Well, yes, but I mean, where the kinds of weapons we've been building for the last 60 years are, really have some impact, and the kind of leadership of military. I think in that sense, things are going pretty well. But I think there are fundamental issues in relationships among countries, and especially when you start talking about other countries, which are now called the Global South, which I now take to mean everybody who's not aligned against Russia and China. Then, now maybe you can say, well, I really don't care about the Global South. Never cared about them before, don't really see a need to care about them now. I suppose that's an argument, in which case, okay, but to the extent that this is now influencing a lot of other things in the larger world, and that you have Russia, having the sanctions made, much less effective than they were because other countries are providing the resources or the markets that we took away from them, then I think it is still a very substantial factor. So
I want to also push you a little on the question of rising anti-Americanism. I don't dispute that the experience of the Trump years dulled the sheen of our example in any way. It was a disaster for American soft power. But, that kind of polling always strikes me as being the least reliable and the least interesting.
Okay, but
I just want to mention an old saw from my colleagues in the Middle East diplomacy world, who often said the only more effective way to get people in the Middle East to turn out en masse, the only more reliable way than having a protest against the U.S. is to hand out green cards.
Yeah.
And
now notice,
I don't think that's changed.
I did not utter the phrase anti-American or anti-Americanism. I quoted the poll as saying that it looks to the United States as an example to emulate. Not even they don't want to go there. They don't want to come here. It's like, okay, what kind of political system do we want? The Americans are calling this democracy, but I don't quite understand. Somebody wins more votes, but he loses the presidency and this court which overturns everything. There's a lot of things that a foreigner would look at and say, no, this doesn't strike me as something I want to see in my country. That's what I mean. Or that's what this poll.
Well, there's no question that the Electoral College is not our best calling card. But I'm going to just make one last, put one last thing on the table, and then we'll open up for the audience. I completely agree with you about, China, welcome to the Middle East, and please take as much of it as you'd like. And I don't, I think only the most superficial of analysts think that the Iran-Saudi deal is worth the paper it's printed on, and we can ask a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia
there's
about that.
There's been a lot of paper that's been printed on.
Yeah, so. I know. Well, there are a lot of superficial analysts. The Middle East, unfortunately, is still a lot like what was Trotsky talking about, the War of the Revolution. You may not be interested.
About the war, you may not be interested in war,
but the war is interested in you.
Yeah.
So the U.S. ability to get out of the Middle East will still
like
remain.
Michael Corleone in Godfather 3, they keep pulling me back in.
Yeah.
The only good thing about that movie, but
Yeah, but the other two are
the other two are great.
All right. Let us now open it up to the crowd. Please do wait for the microphone. Let's start with our Saudi expert right up here, and he better talk about Saudi. No.
Okay, if you force me. Thank you very much, Fred, for a great talk. I'm going to start on something different, which is, I think you persuaded me, and probably pretty much everyone in the room, that this is not the Cold War. But I think in line with what Dana said, this is not necessarily good news. Right? The Cold War had the big advantage of predictability and clarity, and the United States was competing with the Soviet Union, but the only area in which the Soviet Union really could compete, maybe after an initial phase where it had some ideology that was, Marxism had some kind of attraction. At the end of the day, it was only military power. Now, the problem with China is it competes in a lot of areas and very well. And the problem strikes me that what we're looking at is a scenario where the United States of America and China are competing for influence in the Indo-Pacific. And China has a lot to offer in terms of markets and technology and investments. And it has the military power to back it up. And I would say, if you look at European history, and John could correct me on this, the Prussian army didn't count for a whole lot until 1866, in a sense, right? There were decades of peace in Europe.
1756.
Yeah, sure. That's true. No, that's true. But but there was 1806 as well, right? crashing, right? A defeat of the Prussian army. And then there was a long peace in Europe. So you couldn't really know how well these guys would do. But they had a very good general staff, and they were interested in new technologies, and they put them to very good use against Denmark, Austria, and France. So I would warn anyone to estimate the capability of the Chinese to inflict huge damage on American forces across the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's really quite an it's not the Cold War for sure, but it's a very uncomfortable situation. And at the end of the day, if you look at the amount of economic growth, global economic growth that comes out of the Indo-Pacific, then it is true that whoever dominates the Indo-Pacific has a huge edge. And that is, I think, the combustible mix right there. On the Saudi issue, I totally agree with you. God bless the Chinese. In reality, there were some other people involved there. The Iraqis and the Omanis also had a hand in this, but the Chinese sort of, were masters of the ceremony at the end of the day. And in my mind, that's a good thing. And, whether, what it amounts to, we'll see. But there's plenty of things that have been agreed in the Middle East with the Americans as guarantor that really haven't, stood the test of time. So
I would add to your comments on Indo-Pacific, strengthening your point in one way, is that, we have been the kind of air and naval forces we have in the Pacific, not getting too mired in the weeds on this, but it's basically these gigantic aircraft carriers, and then fleets of boats whose main purpose is to defend the aircraft carrier. And if the threat is these swarms of anti-ship munitions, which can home right in on the aircraft carrier and blow big holes in them, what are we doing? And the Navy in getting more money, and the Air Force in getting more money, they're not saying, we need to focus on a different... No, they're just building more of the same things that they've been building for the last 60 years. And but see, this is the other thing that, we are now, if you add up every aspect of the military budget, not just the Defense Department, it now adds up to $1 trillion. And nobody, and I mean nobody, is asking questions like, for example, $60 billion for nuclear weapons in 1 year. Nobody is asking, well, how many nuclear weapons do we really need? To do what? No, it's all theater. They're building new ones, we have to build new ones. There's really, seriously, no, and even with the conventional weapons, it's all like more money, more. Nobody asking, are we building the right kinds of things? Are we really, I used to work on Capitol Hill as a staffer, and there were people on the Armed Services Committees who would go through the line items, everything in the budget. This is redundant, this really doesn't pass its test, this really is no longer suited for this mission. Nobody is doing this now. I'm not exaggerating. Nobody is doing it. And so they're just propping everything up, more. It's not a way to run a military, really.
Let's go from one centrist extreme to the other here. Torsten.
I'm Torsten Benner with the Global Public Policy Institute here in Berlin. Thanks for a great talk, Fred. I always love talks when they manage to make me disagree with them. And you've succeeded beyond my wildest dreams with that. Now, I don't even want to contest because it's a semantic issue on whether it's a Cold War or not. I think we're dealing with serious issues and it goes beyond semantics, although I would think there's some use in combining some sort of new Cold War under conditions of multipolarity. I think it resembles more that than it resembles a concert of powers of the previous days. But I want to challenge you on two fronts. First, on your kind of assessment of China. There's a book by James Mann, 2007, on the China fantasy, and your assessment reminded me a little bit of that, because to me it's a fairly fantastic view of China as not very powerful, not having ideological convictions that would radiate beyond its borders, and really nothing to worry about because they're mired in their own problems. I think we have to worry about China even if it gets stuck in the middle income trap, because with all the power it has, it will not kind of sit there trapped in a quiet way. So I fundamentally disagree with you in the assessment of China. And the funny thing is, the countries, neighboring China in the region, some of which also disagree. I mean, you said you had never heard anything about this Quad thing, this ridiculous whatever. Well, the last thing I heard is that Australia spent, the better part of, its military GDP committing itself to upward of 250 billion euros in the coming years to buy US, UK nuclear submarines because they feel threatened by China. So even if your material assessment of China, if that was true, I'm enough of we're all enough of constructivists then you would need to explain to me that all these other countries plus the US domestic public opinion would believe that China is not a threat, because then only would we live in the world that you think we live in. And I don't necessarily think there's any near-term scenario short of some sort of implosion in the US domestically where you say, like, we just focus on our own problems. Because the one thing that's gluing the US together is the China threat scenario in a sense.
Well,
that's not going away.
I feel like, let's re-roll the film, because I don't recognize a single thing that you said I said. I never said that China has no power or that they're weak, when I was talking about America building up its own internal strength, I absolutely was not suggesting any more than George Kennan was that we therefore ignore the rest of the world. I was simply talking about the way that we build up, stable alliances of people that take us seriously. I certainly did not mean, and in terms of the Quad, Australia is doing quite a lot, Japan is doing quite a lot, but it's not as the Quad. For a while, where is India in all of this, for example? Nowhere. So, I mean, it's not, this was going to be the new NATO, the Quad. I mean, I remember reading these articles. I'd say there hasn't been much written about the Quad. Part of that is because NATO has come back up, and partly because there's a lot of bilateral things going on with the U.S. and the countries of Asia Pacific, and I'm kind of stunned, really, because I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining this, but I don't recognize saying any of the things that you're rebutting, and I would agree with most of your comments.
Well, as my kids would say, shots fired. Okay, right back there.
Thank you. I'm Rudi Bresser from the Freie Universität, and of course, Fred, I also very much enjoyed your presentation, otherwise I wouldn't have raised my hand. The major takeaway is that the state of affairs in the world are utterly confusing right now, at least the way I perceived your presentation. One thing, however, and I'm coming back to China, that confuses me particularly is the stance of the U.S. foreign policy elite on China, in the sense that they constantly advocate that there is this danger, this military danger, and I wonder whether emphasizing this is not just another example of what Steve Walt and others have called threat inflation, in the sense that here a threat is being used or built up to really further the economic goals of the United States. I think the major concern is that the U.S. fears that China might become an economic power that equals or even surpasses the United States. And then, of course, pointing to the military threat is an easy way to suggest that countermeasures have to be taken. If China is making in the Asian Pacific area or in other areas of the world, really offering countries using market principles, something that they can use to develop their own countries, so let them do it. And the United States might find other ways to get their act together.
Well, I would say a couple of things. First, we were with a group of German newspaper reporters and editors, and somebody there referred to the American foreign policy elite, and I had to laugh because I didn't know there was one. So when you talk about these days, I'm not quite sure. Well, and of course, Dan Benjamin is one of them, sure. But
Last man standing.
yeah. But I'm not sure what it is, and I don't think Steve Walt is these days either. But I would disagree with you a bit from your point of view. I think what China is doing.
The same anyway.
That's right. What China is doing, it can't be discounted. I mean, this business of creating islands in the middle of the South Pacific Sea, and then militarizing these islands, and then declaring this is now what the border of China is, and with the 12-mile principles and so forth. These can't be dismissed as just a lot of things that have no consequence on anything. They are building up certain kinds of strength in ballistic missiles and anti-missile strength that they weren't doing a decade or 2 decades ago. I think where I think people do go wrong is looking at China as strictly an adversary. I mean, there are, I think, a number of areas where the U.S. and China have identical or at least converging interests, and where steps can be taken. Keeping North Korea from having nuclear weapons, anti-terrorism, pandemics.
They got them already.
Well, you're right, but I mean, keeping them from
Using them,
yeah. Putting them on that's one thing. I find very puzzling this notion that we cannot acknowledge that North Korea is a nuclear state, because this will screw up lots of our talking points about things. Yeah, it makes no sense to me. But and in fact, I think Tony Blinken, he was all set to go to Beijing. He was going to meet with Xi. This was going to be the first time a Secretary of State met with the head of the Chinese party in 6 years. I'd been told that they were going to discuss things that we might be able to cooperate on. I mean, without neglecting the things that we disagree on, but what are some things that we... And then, of course, the balloon happened, which I take as kind of the gods of history's little signal to everybody that not everything is systemic, that some things happen for the stupidest reasons in the world. And the trip had to be called off because that's all that they would have talked about. But I do think that there is still an opportunity and in fact, I also think that, getting back to the business about fragmented power, there is no way that the United States can have long-term and persistent influence in the world if we are at some kind of war with both Russia and China. Cleaning things up with Russia right now is both impossible and appalling. So I think, I do not think that just because we are both aspiring or actual great powers, that war is inevitable and therefore let's get to it or let's get prepared for it. I think there does have to be some way of getting back on track with diplomacy with China to the extent that it's possible, and to have that perhaps broaden out as it takes some deep roots. And I hope that we're not too late for that.
Is there a woman who's going to ask a question? I just, I hate to be too woke here, but Anna. You're not really going to ask a question? Oh, you are really going to ask. Oh, good, great.
Question mark at the end.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned 2 times about the role of the media in sort of creating this inevitability, and I was wondering if you could expand more on that. You mentioned The Economist, and I think maybe the New York Times earlier, and you as being of the press. I'm curious if you could just expand on.
Well, I think part of it also goes to this whole new Cold War thing. I think there is a tendency, and I don't know what the ultimate cause of this is, but there's a tendency for reporters, and you tell me if this is true in Europe as well, I don't know, to have a very limited historical perspective. So most reporters were alive when the Cold War was going on. They have some memory of it. They might have even read a little bit about it. And so when things start getting tense between two big countries, oh, this is the Cold War again. You know, forget it might actually be more, have something more in common with something going on in the 17th century. But I have yet to read a single article in an mainstream American newspaper or magazine which refers back that far. You'd be, in fact, if you did it, you would be thought of as being a little pretentious, not necessarily more insightful. So it's the Cold War. You know, anytime something happens, it's Cold War. Anytime interests are, you know, like this whole thing with Saudi Arabia and Iran and China. If we were some other country looking at that, we'd say, well, that's interesting. But no, it's, oh, China instead of us. I remember, and Russia's kind of this way too, and I'll tell you a funny story that I think is instructive. A friend of mine, you might know him as well, Robert Kaiser, when he was the Washington Post's correspondent in Moscow in the mid-'70s, when Nixon was thrown out, or Nixon resigned, quite sophisticated. One of his handlers at the foreign ministry said, so when is Henry Jackson going to become president? And he said, what do you mean? He goes, well, I mean, this Watergate thing.
You better explain.
That's not what this is all about. This is obviously a struggle between Nixon as the purveyor of détente and Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, who was the leading anti-détente figure, in collusion with the capitalist press. And so the anti-détente people have clearly won. And so when is Henry Jackson becoming president? So in other words, there is a tendency to view what's going on in the world, and I think this is especially true with larger powers, through the vision, through the prism of your own interests, or your own history, or your own knowledge of the rest of the world. Therefore, tensions happening with China, tensions happening with Russia, oh, this is like the Cold War, because the Cold War is all that they know.
Well, Fred, you're a reporter.
Yeah.
I think it's on you to write that piece.
I have written pieces like this. But yeah, I'm kind of a funny kind of reporter, I guess. I never went to journalism school. I never took a journalism class. But not that I'm necessarily proud of that or anything. But I mean, I learned about, I came up as a specialist, and I'd been educated in those things. And there were a few of us coming up around that time, but you know, not very many.
You said I'm a funny kind of journalist, and I'm reminded of the line, as long as we're throwing around movie lines, from Fargo, where the woman is asked, what do you look like? You looked funny. Well, funny how? Funny ha-ha or funny weird? Just funny.
maybe both. Who knows?
All right. In keeping faith with our home audience, I have a question. It's a long question. It has been said that there's no important ideological element in the current international situation. That may be an exaggeration. Still, from the point of view of Europeans, Russia is an authoritarian country, invading a democratic one, opposing its democratic decision to get closer to NATO and the EU. China is the biggest anti-democratic power, menacing Taiwan, which is one of the most democratic countries in the world. Moreover, China has clearly tried to undermine the European Union's cohesion by forging special and privileged economic ties with Italy during the first Conti cabinet. It actually seems, at least in the eyes of Europeans, that anti-democratic countries are trying to expand their anti-democratic visions among democratic ones. There's no question mark at the end, but I would ask you to...
is that true?
Yeah, I would ask you to examine the truth content.
Well, what I meant by that is that whereas in the Cold War, the Russians, the Soviets would look either for communist allies or for allies that they could turn communist through helping with elections or whatever. Whereas China, they have no such demands. I mean, they were able to get Saudi Arabia and Iran into the same room because They don't care about this Sunni Shiite thing. It's all markets and ports to us. Italy, I mean, they didn't say, okay, here we are, and by the way, here is, the latest, little red book by Chairman Xi, memorize it by the next party Congress. In that sense, that's what I meant. They'll take inroads where they can get them, and it's very mercantilist foreign policy. And yes, while they are, Hungary is a rather authoritarian country. I think Ukraine, until very recently, would we have considered Ukraine a terribly democratic country? I don't know, maybe not, although maybe we were misleading ourselves. It's been pointed out that in the most recent Ukrainian election, the far right-wing party only got, 2% of the vote, which is the least of any European country. So we've been...
I think we would have invited Ukraine.
But yeah, I think, I don't think that democracy versus authoritarianism is the central element in any of these conflicts.
Well, if anything, it seems like the Biden administration has been, downplaying the democracy versus authoritarianism thing as we, for example, try to get very close to Vietnam, which is a problematic partner.
Lately, or Mr. Fistbump. By the way, I thought that was terribly unfair. You remember when he
talking about MBS?
Yes.
Yeah.
The fist bump. Remember, he had just come from Israel, where he had hugged and kissed everybody. So I took the fist bump as actually a statement of modest greetings. I didn't see it as an embrace.
Well, it's the perfidious press that
it
played
is
it up
the perfidious
again.
press. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Malcolm Jorgensen from the Max Planck Institute for International Law. My question related to the theme of the talk, which is that it seems to be that labeling something as a Cold War matters is one of the subtexts here. And so I had a question about the official statements that are regularly put out by China and Russia, where they accuse the West of adopting a Cold War mentality. This is a frequent criticism that they should end this Cold War mentality. So my first question is, do you think this is a good faith belief or just diplomatic rhetoric by these countries that they actually think this is some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy? And secondly, do you think that this Cold War mentality, notwithstanding this rhetoric, might actually be influencing Russia and Chinese strategic thought here? Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. I think it's self-interested because, what does the Cold War rhetoric do? It actually elevates Russia and China. It makes them look more powerful than they really are. If they're engaged in a global titanic struggle with the United States, it makes them look stronger. And also, it's a way of trying to minimize or to put a dark shadow on the U.S. motives for opposing Russia and China. It has nothing to do with the invasion of Ukraine. It has nothing to do with the militarization of the South China Sea. It's because the United States is just back in this Cold War framework. They're against us just because of who we are. It's not because of what we're doing. And therefore, it's propaganda to countries that might be wavering, in the middle ground, which is a lot more countries than we sometimes think. So I think it's quite it's a tactical move and rather shrewd.
Okay, I have succeeded in dragooning Academy Fellow Abe Newman into asking the last question. He's been reluctant to ask a question all semester, but he works on this, so I'm not taking no for an answer. Abe.
Great. So, Fred, I'm gonna be provocative, or not. But
wait, which one?
Well, you'll see. I'm going to go back and forth.
History will tell.
Exactly. So I have two questions. They're kind of related, but the first is maybe just challenging the notion that we're in this depowered world where there's no, because one of the, I think there was
fragmented, not depowered.
Okay, but one of the, did the Russia war just really remind the world of American hegemony, that Europe has no power and Russia actually has no power, And so it's just the US is the one that has the power. Okay, so that's my kind of provocative.
Wait, the Russia war, meaning the Russia invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, that Russia's military is not really a global military. It can barely conduct a war on its neighbor. It's going to, suffer tremendous consequences from this war for its economy, for its military. It's been shown to be, I would say, a failure at this, and at the same time, the European militaries have been shown to be relatively a failure. And so who's left holding the money and the military? It's the US, and it's the only player. So contra the argument that the US is in decline, there's this other story, which is America triumphalist, and and that's why China's freaking out. Okay, so that's one question. The other question is, the U.S. is running what I see as a foreign policy, not of a Cold War, but of a sectoral containment. They're saying there are these sectors that are going to be a threat potentially, and so we need to contain China in those things. And I guess my question to you is just, is that a better policy? Do you know what I mean? I agree completely with your assessment. We should not be talking about a Cold War. We should be talking about sector containment, and that's what the Biden administration is doing. And is that viable, or is that just as bad as the picture you're painting? So you don't need to answer both. Or
no, those are good. Those are good. The first one, I would say it certainly turned out that way. I don't think Russia intended it, obviously. Big confession. In January 2022, I wrote a column, you can look it up, regrettably, saying Putin is not going to invade Ukraine. And I went through the 8 reasons why, the various ways in which their army would fall apart, all of which were completely spot on, but I was wrong, he invaded anyway, okay? So, and it is a fair question. And I throw this out as a question, how afraid should the rest of Europe be? If Russia cannot conquer a country right on its border, much of which was really quite sympathetic to Russia and feeling brothers or cousins before it began, and really, quite honestly, if all Putin had done was just to chop off the Donbass, I don't think we'd be talking about a Ukraine war. That would have been the end of it, and nobody would have done much about it. And yet he can't even get these guys who are just, running ambush operations at the beginning, thwarting their tank columns. And even now, they're still just throwing columns of tanks down a road and waiting for some sniper to bump off the guy in front, and then everybody else goes around and kills all of the others. So should Europe really be afraid that Poland is next, and then the Baltics, and then, I don't know. In terms of the U.S., we're kind of constrained. Russia does still have this pesky nuclear arsenal, and nuclear deterrence, works both ways. And it deters more than just nuclear war. It deters getting involved in certain other kinds of wars, too. Look, if Russia did not have a nuclear weapons, there is no doubt that NATO would have got involved in this war directly, and I'm pretty sure NATO Air Command or U.S. Air Command in Europe has a plan right now to take out every single Russian military facility, the entire country of Ukraine, in a matter of days or hours, and would think nothing of it, but they have these nuclear weapons. So we're all constrained in what we can do. So I don't see an American triumphalist thing about this. And in fact, I see Biden being not only pragmatic, but also quite smart in doing everything he can to keep that bold red line between U.S. assistance and U.S. direct involvement, because he knows that the second some American soldiers get killed or pilots get shot down, that's the end of popular support for this war. And so he's making sure that they're not in any position to do that. Your second question about, just give me a keyword again to remind me. Sectoral. I think that's an excellent idea. And I think it would also meet with much more popular favor because, he is trying to sell a lot of this stuff as a global struggle. And it's not really a global struggle. It's not democracy versus authoritarianism. And if it were, we'd have a lot more problems in our hands than we pretend to be. At the same time, there does need to be some moral component to American foreign policy. I mean, we can have a big debate about how much it should be and how much of it is real and how much of it is for show, but I think we can't just be, the China of the West, just purely mercantilist. So there have to be some principles involved. But yeah, I think as a matter of fact, what we are doing is sectoral containment, sectoral counter-defense, and so forth. Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, that's a great place to end. So, Fred, thank you for a very provocative and engaging and wide-ranging discussion.
Thank you.